So we have, I mean, the reporting information isn't required until basically next year. So CSESA has done a survey as to what districts were thinking about spending the dollars on late last year, and AXA is actually, I think, just finished a survey of their membership in the fields.
Great, great. Senator Weiland.
I appreciate, Mr. Chairman, that we will have an entire session devoted to Common Core because I think we need that. We discussed some of this yesterday in Education Committee, and I hope the chairman will bear with me as I ask some of these same questions.
Senator Weiland, if I can just interrupt briefly, if we're going deep into Common Core, okay,
not deep.
Let's save that for March 20th.
We will save it. Just a couple of comments. You've asked about what progress is and whether or not there may be more money available. I think it's fair to say from the testimony yesterday, or at least some of it, and my observation, that it is utter, complete, total chaos. And what I mean by that is any individual district may be doing something, but some of the testimony talked about some districts doing things that didn't fit, others doing things that do fit. There's not yet, when you reach the high school level, you're talking, and let's talk ELA, there's some misunderstandings, at least the districts I talk to, between are English teachers going to teach this only, or are other teachers, and I guess the consensus are others. I'd just like to point out some of these things that if we have some data in May, I think it's going to be a struggle to get it. I would hope that, frankly, we would have some pilot programs or take the best of those, run them all the way through to the assessments. Because when you look at the assessments out there, the assessments, I don't think, really quite get where we want to go. So I would just throw some of these things out that we can discuss later on in that next hearing.
Thank you, Senator Weiland. Senator Liu.
I'm just interested in maybe just a brief conversation, because apparently Department of Finance and the CDE have different ideas about school bonding. Assemblymember Buchanan has a bond issue that she'd like to put forward, and the conversation among the governor's office is that there may be another way to take a look at how we finance school buildings and things like that. Can you elaborate what the ideas or what the thought is going forward?
When it comes to the actual bond itself, we're aware, obviously, that that Member Buchanan has introduced 2253. The administration doesn't have an official position on that bill, nor do we have an official position on an education bond, period, at this point. As we laid out in the A pages, I don't know if you've had a chance to read through the facility section of the A pages that went along with the governor's budget, but we, for a second year, laid out a number of concerns that we have with the existing program. And so I think prior to engaging in any serious discussion about a bond, we want to have a conversation about how the program works right now, because we think that there are some fundamental problems with the existing program. And so we need to have, I think, a frank discussion about how that program operates before we can really proceed to have, a discussion about a bond moving forward. But to your other comment, the administration is obviously very interested in looking at, different ways to fund schools moving into the future as well, as opposed, there may be, some level of state support that's still required. I mean, we don't have a position, like I said, on providing a specific amount at this point, but I don't think that, we're in a position to support a status quo bond similar to, the last 2 or 3 bonds right now with that state share investment, without looking at different ways to finance these things at the local level and or asking for, an increased local contribution to sustain this as we sort of move forward.
Okay. Thank you. That's fine.
Thank you, Senator Liu. Turning to the Prop 98 Reserve Fund, For finance, I know we don't have all the details yet, but this reserve fund, who would hold the fund? Can the school districts hold the reserves themselves? Is that what you propose?
No, the reserve would be held at the state level. Similar to the BSA, it would be a specific reserve set aside for Prop 98, but at the state level.
So the schools could only access that reserve when a formula kicked in and the central holding said it was all right for schools to access that.
Yeah, so at any point in time when, unless declared like an education fiscal emergency, that would be different and the governor would do that. But so at any point in time when the guarantee cannot fund growth in COLA, then a withdrawal from that reserve would be given back to education for funding.
Let me ask the LEO, do you have any concerns about the reserve and the process?
So we are waiting to seek detailed language to have kind of a formal recommendation or not on it. I think one of the things we understand the intent here in terms of smoothing out Prop 98. Prop 98 is subject to big spikes, ups and downs, and something like what the governor's proposing would smooth out some of that spending and potentially result in some years, instead of having to make big cuts, there would be some money available. I think one of the things you might want to consider in looking at it is how exactly when it's okay to use the reserves. I think one of conceptually understanding what the governor's proposal is, one of the concerns we'd have is if every year you have to provide growth in COLA, it could be that you have several kind of sluggish years and you drain your reserve just to ensure growth in COLA is there. And then when you get to year 4 or 5 and then you are actually in a recession, there's nothing left in the reserve to be used. And that sort of, we think that if you do want to do something like this, you'd want to kind of smooth out, particularly the really bad years, so that there is some funding available. I think that's one thing to consider. I think that the other piece in the beginning, in terms of the governor's proposal, is saying we're going to set aside some funding for in a reserve, and we're gonna leave that for a rainy day. Right now, the way our current system, or even with ACA 4, the state is doing that, but it's really doing that and ignoring Prop 98. And really, the setting aside the funding, it means that you have less non-98 funding to spend. In this proposal, you're saying we're going to set aside money. We're going to set aside both non-98 and Prop 98 money, and so that. I think that's just something for you to consider as well. But I think we're waiting for additional language before we have a specific recommendation. And
that additional language, when did you say we could expect that? By what date?
We're hoping to try to get something out this month. I mean, that's our goal. We're still having some internal discussions about the language. That's what we're trying to do, though, is get it out sometime this month. I can't make a bulletproof guarantee that you're going to see it this month, but that's what we're certainly trying for.
So we can expect it by March 31st, not guaranteed, but we would expect it by that date.
That's our hope.
Very good, thank you. One more question for the LEO, and then if there are any other questions. This is regard to the deferrals. I know you've said that you have few problems with the idea of paying back the deferrals because we want to get that payback before Prop 30 runs out. But there are districts that, especially large urban districts, it seems, that would be more comfortable having more money for programs now and keep to the old deferral payback schedule. Are there particular programs that you've all thought about that might be better to enact or to more highly fund rather than paying back the deferrals?
Well, I think we would say that we do think it's important to prioritize paying off our wall of debt obligations in education prior to the end of Prop 30. I think that's our biggest concern. So whether that's deferrals or mandates or others, I think we don't have a particular preference. So one approach could be to not pay down as much deferrals this year, and instead provide some money for paying off the mandate backlog, for example. That would allow the state to pay off some of its obligations, and that funding for the mandate for mandates would then be sort of one-time funding that school districts could use for other purposes. That would be an alternative approach. I think from our perspective, the biggest concern is we do understand that there is demand for increasing program, and we think, the governor's proposal still does, it's about a 10% increase in funding year to year for schools. So we do think it's important to make sure that some funding is dedicated to paying off those one-time obligations. So by the time you get to the expiration of Prop 30, none of these are left. And also just before we ever get into potentially a recession again, which is definitely a possibility.
Anyone else wish to comment on that?
No, I mean, from our perspective, it's not good budgeting practice to continue these deferrals. It's not honest budgeting. I mean, so, we're aware that, there are folks that would prefer to continue to operate, a program or, operate at a particular level and continue with the practice of deferrals, but that's not something that, we're very supportive of. This governor's made it pretty clear that he wants more honest and transparent budgeting, and certainly one way to assure that is to pay off these deferrals moving forward, so.
Okay, just for the record, that there are district board members out there who will say something like, that third grader out there who's going to be in third, fourth, and fifth grade the next 3 years, he or she won't have a chance to repeat those when there's more programmatic money after deferrals are paid off. So let's take a little bit longer to pay off the deferral. So we are talking about real kids out there who, because of the accelerated deferral payback, aren't getting certain programs or services that arguably the state could afford. Any other questions or comments from the panel, from senators? Yes, Senator Weiland.
I heard in my office on the television just before I got down here some reference to English language learners. And I just wanted to ask about any concern about that may be, since LCFF is specifically designed to deal with some of that, perhaps we need to wait for that panel. But is this either the department or LAO or finance involved in looking at those programs? Or maybe I misheard that? I guess not. Okay.
And I think we will get to that more in the
LCFF. It's a good fit. I would just say I hope that all those entities, the department, finance, and LAO, do look at the results, because this is a challenge we know we have. We've had it for decades, and I think it's time to make sure that we fix it. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator Weiland. And with that, I'd like to thank and excuse this panel, with the exception of Ms. Ramos, who's going to be on the next panel as well, and ask Chris Ferguson from the Department of Finance, Carolyn Chu from the LAO, Elisa Wynn from the State Board of Education, and Peter Birdsall from the County Superintendent's Educational Services Association to please come forward and fill the table and the sides if there's not enough room at the table. And for members of the public who are here, we will have public comment after this panel, and the comment will be on either of the panels, anything we've discussed today. For this panel, we'll be talking about the local control funding formula, in particular its implementation, what the governor's proposals are, and we'll begin with the Department of Finance telling us how the LCFF is funded according to the governor's first budget proposal.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members. Lori Carney with the Department of Finance, and I'll be happy to present to you this morning the governor's 1415 proposals related to the local control funding formula. As a result of greater than anticipated Proposition 98 resources, the governor's budget makes some significant investments in K-12 education, as we just heard, with LCFF implementation being a top priority. We propose about $45.7 billion in total funding for LCFF, which is about $2 billion more than we originally anticipated being able to invest. Of this total funding, $4.5 billion helps to close the gap between the current funding and the target level of funding LEAs will receive upon full implementation of LCFF. This $4.5 billion will close about 28% of the 14-15 funding gap for each school district and charter school, and $25.9 million will close the entire gap for county offices of education. Additionally, the governor's budget transfers funding from two categorical programs to the LCFF, the Specialized Secondary Program and the Agricultural Vocational Education Program. Funding will be provided to the districts that currently receive these categorical funds. Consistent with the principles of LCFF, we believe this will provide LEAs greater flexibility to offer these programs in a way that meets the needs of their students. I also want to note that the basic aid fair share calculation is adjusted to account for one-time RDA. This provides an additional $16 million, Proposition 98, holding districts harmless for the receipt of one-time RDA resources in the 12-13 fiscal year, therefore ensuring that no district receives less than it did in 12-13. The basic aid fair share reduction was designed to ensure that revenue limit reductions applied equitably to all school districts. Related to the implementation of the LCFF, the administration proposes to create a continuous appropriation for LCFF implementation funding, ensuring that the formula is implemented on schedule in future years. The current continuous appropriation mechanism provides districts their prior year funding amount, adjusted for changes in ADA, even without an approved state budget in place. Similarly, our proposal is to continuously appropriate a certain percentage of Proposition 98 that would not only fund a district's current base and changes in ADA caseload, but would also automate the amount districts receive for gap funding, that difference between their current funding level and their target LCFF funding level. So specifically on this proposal, 76% of Proposition 98 would be continuously appropriated in 2014-15, and 79% would be continuously appropriated each year thereafter until full implementation of LCFF. I'll note here that during LCFF implementation, the COLA factor would be applied to districts' target funding levels, which would not change under a continuous appropriation proposal. After full implementation, COLA would be subject to a Budget Act appropriation. We feel that a continuous appropriation would provide districts predictability and certainty that they will get closer to their target LCFF funding level each year. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, thank you. Again, we'll hold off on questions until we hear from the entire panel. We'll move now to the Legislative Analyst's Office.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, Mr. Weiland. My name is Carolyn Chu from the Legislative Analyst's Office. There's a handout in front of you that sort of gives the very basics of what the LCFF was. However, since this panel is intimately familiar with what was passed last year, we can skip over the first couple of pages. I'll just note that along with the new funding formula, the legislature and the state enacted a new accountability system that's centered around 8 state priorities, which are listed on page 2, and that every district must adopt a plan called a local control and accountability plan that spells out how they're going to meet their goals within these 8 state priority areas for every school and for every subgroup within their district. Moreover, as part of the new accountability system, there's a new system of support and intervention for school districts that's centered on evaluation rubrics, which the state board is still in the process of adopting. And the state also created the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, which is a support system that's still under development, which I believe the department and the state board will also speak to. So just moving to page 5 of our handout, just sort of giving you a little information on where we are relative to implementation of the local control funding formula, both the formula itself and the accompanying accountability portions. Last year, the legislature appropriated $2.1 billion to start moving towards these new LCFF targets. That represented about 12% of the funding gap between where we had been in 2012-13 and where we're aiming to go. This January, the State Board also adopted regulations that govern the use of the supplemental and concentration funds, which are for English learners, low-income students, and foster youth. And in addition, the State Board adopted the local control and accountability template that districts must use in order to develop these LCAPs. Districts will have to adopt their first LCAPs this coming July, by July 1st, 2014, and county offices will have to start reviewing those LCAPs after districts adopt them. There are a couple of remaining milestones. One, we have yet to fully implement the funding rates, but we also, the State Board must also adopt the evaluation rubrics upon which the system for support and intervention is really founded. And lastly, the role of the collaborative remains somewhat unclear. We have yet to see what that really will look like, but I think the State Board and the department will speak to that. So just moving to, skipping over page 6, the department already covered, the Department of Finance already covered what their proposals are for the local control funding formula. In terms of our recommendations on page 7, we believe that dedicating virtually all of the new ongoing funds to LCFF implementation is consistent with the implementation plan for the new formula. Moreover, we recommend that you approve the shift of 2 additional categorical programs into the LCFF. But we recommend rejecting the proposal to automate local control funding formula appropriations, as this takes away discretion from the legislature in determining how funding under Proposition 98 should be dedicated and how quickly or slowly we should move towards full implementation targets. That's all I have.
Okay, thank you very much. We move on now to the State Board of Education. Lynn?
Elisa Wynn with the State Board of Education. As previously mentioned, the State Board adopted emergency regulations in January, which were approved by the Office of Administrative Law. They're in place for 180 days. These regulations included both expenditure regulations and, as Carolyn said, the Local Control and Accountability Plan, which we call the LCAP template. LEAs must complete their LCAP by July 1st, 2014, using this template and abide by the expenditure regulations. At that same time in January, the board also began the permanent rulemaking process on these regulations. Currently, we're within our 45-day public comment period on the permanent regulations, which will end on March 17th. Both State Board and the Department of Ed staff must work together to respond to, and the board will consider every comment when the permanent regulations come back before the board. That will likely be in either May or July of this year. Of course, we don't know yet what changes may be made to the permanent regs as part of this process, but as a result, there may be some changes to the expenditure regs or to the template for the 15-16 LCAP cycle. State Board staff working with CDE staff and our contractor WestEd are in the initial stages of developing a process for the development of the evaluation rubric. Statute requires the board to adopt by October 1st, 2015, an evaluation rubric or rubrics that allow LEAs to do self-evaluations, identify LEAs in need of technical assistance, and allow the superintendent of public instruction to identify LEAs in need of intervention. The development of the rubric will build off the requirements and regulations in the LCAP and also be informed by these initial LCAP implementation cycles. We are also working very closely with the department on developing a vision for the California Collaborative that supports and is integrated with our LCFF accountability system as a whole. The State Board will include an LCFF update item on each of their board agendas for this year and likely for the next few years. Coming up in March, our board meeting is March 12th and 13th, and our agenda was just posted to our website this past Friday for the March meeting. So for March, the LCFF update item will discuss resources that are available and in development by CDE, the State Board staff, and WestEd to assist LEAs in completing their LCAPs during this first round. We'll also feature county offices and school districts who will share how they're doing on their LCAP process up to this point, and a few organizations who've developed materials to model promising LCAP practices. State Board members have made it clear to staff that this is a process. They want to closely monitor the implementation of LCFF and make adjustments as needed. As many of you who may have followed our regulations process, we spent many months working on those. It was a long process. And also the board, working with the Department of Ed and WestEd, did some extensive outreach through meetings, calls, et cetera, with education stakeholders. We're going to continue this practice of reaching out to all education stakeholders as we move forward through regular calls and requests for feedback. That's all I have.
Okay, thank you. We'll move now to the Department of Education. Ms. Ramos.
Thank you. Over the last 7 months, the department has come a long way in the implementation.
Seems like 7 years.
In the implementation of LCFF. We have worked with the administration to resolve implementation issues and identified necessary statutory cleanup. We have an apportionment data collection software to reflect the department's interim solution for allocating funds to LEAs. We have identified all data collection requirements for the implementation of LCFF, and we are nearly complete in building our new data collection software. We anticipate the software to be released in March, and we will be providing training to LEAs. The department has been meeting monthly with county offices of education for implementation updates and is consistently updating CDE's LCFF FAQ website. We have provided assistance to the County Superintendents Association, which has built a calculator to help LEAs estimate their LCFF entitlement. While the calculator has now been taken over by FCMAT, the department continues to provide technical assistance. We have convened the committee required by AB 97 to revise criteria and standards to assess LEA fiscal solvency, and we have incorporated many of the LCFF changes into the audit guide for the 2013-14 and 14-15 audits. Finally, we have developed proposed regulations for the K-3 class size apportionment, which we heard at the March State Board meeting. In regards to the California Collaborative, the department and State Board staff have been working together, and we anticipate having a item at the May or July board meeting to identify a fiscal agent. Finally, the department is on target for the second principal apportionment to be out by July 2nd based on the new funding formula. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And now let's hear from the county superintendents, represented by Peter Birdsall.
Thank you. The California County Superintendents Educational Service Association consists of the 58 county superintendents, so we're deeply engaged in the implementation of LCFF and LCAP. The reference to the calculator, I think the legislature can really feel great about that collaboration. This is, as you know, a whole new funding system. And so our fiscal staff, working with the Department of Education, Department of Finance, created a calculator that school districts could use to estimate as best possible what they were going to get in a new funding system. So it is really the way government's supposed to work, which is agencies working together to support the local implementation. The LCAP is aligned with the AB 1200 fiscal accountability system. County superintendents are required to review and approve school district budgets. The timelines and process for the LCAP really were aligned to that in the legislation last year. So like that process, we are deeply engaged, as county offices are deeply engaged working with their school districts on development of the LCAPs and sharing, to the point of staff at the local level, sharing draft LCAPs and asking questions and trying to work with the Department of Education, Department of Finance to identify questions and then get answers back. So just anecdotally, but widespread across the state, I would say it's fostered a level of collaboration among curriculum staff and fiscal staff that I think is really going to benefit the entire state. It's really been extraordinary within county offices and also at the school district level. With regard to the collaborative, Senator Weiland talked about sharing best practices on Common Core. We're really hoping the collaborative will be established so that it's practitioner-driven, which is to say, what are the needs identified by school districts and county offices and charter schools, and then what's the best way to try and provide resources and support to those agencies. And we think a lot of that is sharing exemplary practices, best practices around Common Core, around parent engagement, community engagement. The list is almost endless, but we're really hoping that model be practitioner-driven. And so we're working with the Department of the State Board to try and get that up and working as soon as possible. We think that'll be a real resource. Happy to answer questions about what's going on, but everybody is deeply engaged in this work. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Thanks to all the panelists. Now we'll take some questions. I'll ask one, then we'll go to Senator Weiland. First, Department of Finance, did you say, Ms. Carney, that there was $2 billion more going to LCFF this year than anticipated?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Now, will that accelerate then the 8-year, was it an 8-year implementation plan? Do you expect to implement sooner than 8 years to get to full implementation?
We're still planning on an 8-year implementation, but we'll kind of get to that end goal a little quicker in the beginning, and then the increases we do anticipate tapering off. So while we'll see maybe the percentage gap closed being a little bit higher in the near term, and then those percentages may reduce, but we're still anticipating funding increasing and being able to implement in 8 years.
Okay, thank you. And for State Board of Education, you'll be monitoring implementation of the LCFF. I know the regs aren't complete yet, is my understanding. But two things I think the legislature is particularly concerned about, or at least I've heard in our meetings. One is that the dollars be used, the dollars that are set aside or targeted to low-income and English learners and foster youth, be used for them, and making the local control as local as possible and giving school sites a great deal of authority. How will you be monitoring that and regulating that?
Sure. So the regulations that we've currently adopted, the emergency regulations, do address this. They require that an LEA must calculate a proportionality percentage. It's based on a formula that's in the regs that helps create a consistent statewide method of estimating what supplemental and concentration grant funding an LEA is getting in any given year. And they'll use this to create a percentage by which they must increase or improve services or do more for their unduplicated students over what they're doing generally for all students. We've also, in our LCAP template, we built it so that it also supports these regulations. This is where the district will, or LEA will, describe how they're meeting those regulations requirements and how they're spending their supplemental and concentration grant funding. Of course, moving through the permanent regs process, we'll be looking at any comments and any changes that need to be made. And we will also be working with, our partners, with CSESA, with districts and our education stakeholders to, hear about how implementation is going, issues, clarify anything that needs to be clarifying. So this is, I think we all understand, especially our board members, that this is going to be a process. They're taking, their authority for regulations very seriously and, want to ensure that, the regulations are done as required and that folks are meeting those.